Well, brothers and sisters, we come in this class to one of the other players in Ezekiel 38, and that is, of course, the European contingent. And it also comes up in Revelation chapter 17 as well. So these are all kind of things that are concurrently going on contemporarily with what we've been looking at in the first class. But also, a lot of it is concurrent with our lives right now, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through this. So in the book of Daniel, if you just want to come to Daniel chapter 7, we have introduced to us here this great vision that Daniel saw, which really is going to then roll out into the book of Revelation. In Daniel chapter 7, Daniel says in verse 2, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, 4 great winds of heaven strove upon the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, different one from another. These great beasts, which are 4 kings or kingdoms, which shall arise out of the earth. And of course, we know we have the Babylonians and the lion, the Medo-Persians and the bear, and of course the Roman, or the Greeks and the leopard. In the 4th beast is that Roman dragon or a crocodile or whatever exactly it is. We're not totally sure in Daniel, but we're told it's dreadful and terrible. But this is expanded on when we come to the book of Revelation. So Revelation is really just looking at that 4th beast, and it's taking it through a series of phases or metamorphoses that go on. So we read in Revelation chapter 12 in verse 3, the first of these phases. There appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and the 7 crowns upon its head. So it identifies with the great beast of Daniel chapter 7 because it has these 10 horns. And that's not a usual characteristic of a creature. Most creatures will have 2 horns. The occasional rhinoceros has 3. But this one with 10 is certainly kind of an anomaly. So we have this great Roman dragon, which of course corresponds with the time period of John himself. This is the vision that he was seeing, the things that were shortly to come to pass. And it would exist from around BC 67 and would continue right on to around AD 312. And of course, it would be wiped out by another individual that would come along, Constantine. And that's the next real sort of area that we get into is this great Christian Roman Empire that would exist from around 312 to 346. And it's described as kind of a composite beast. It arises out of the sea again, like Daniel's did. It's got 7 heads and 10 horns, like the great red dragon. And on the horns, it has 10 crowns. And his heads have the names of blasphemy. And he's kind of composite. He's part of a lion, which is Daniel, the bear, which is Daniel, the leopard, which is Daniel, and of course the dragon gives him his power and his seat and great authority. So it's the next phase in this European development. And then we move on to around the year 799, and we have the resurrection of another European beast. This is the Holy Roman Empire under Charles the Magnificent, so Charlemagne. And this beast, though, coming up out of the earth, well, he's got 2 horns, and it kind of looks like a lamb, but he's got a nasty bite. He speaks like a dragon, right? So it's a dragon in sheep's clothing, so to speak. So it's holy, but it's still Roman. It's a Christian kind of take on this, but it's this Roman Empire. So it's a bit of an imposter, but there it is. And it lasts until 1806. And it's kind of, that's the area that it took. It's kind of Central Europe. France and Germany really is the area that it covers. And Charlemagne's empire would be out of a place called Aachen in Germany. And that's where he would rule from. And of course, this would go on for a period of time, 799 to around 1806, when Napoleon would come along and he would decimate the French emperor after the French Revolution, the Emperor Francis of Austria, in a place called Austerlitz, which was interesting driving here because you have one of those somewhere around about here. We passed through on the way. And so those names get picked up. But it was the place where really the Holy Roman Empire ended and where Napoleon decimated the forces of Austria. And so that would be the end of this empire. And so when you kind of follow this through and just think about it, we had the Roman Empire, which would be Julius Caesar and his cohorts that would follow him. And then it was destroyed and removed. And in its place came the Christian Roman Empire, which was begun, of course, by Constantine. And then it would last for so long, the barbarians would come along, and others, as well, it was divided empire, and the eastern half would last a little bit longer. But it's wiped out, basically. And in its place then would come the Holy Roman Empire, which was around 900 or 799, which would have been, of course, as we said, Charlemagne. And it would go away with the French Revolution. And then following that, there would be a resurrection of this beast that we read about in the book of Revelation. So we've had these empires, and they've come and they've gone. But come, if you would, over to the book of Revelation, chapter 17, because this is where we read that even though we've had this succession of empires, and remember, these are all a magnification of Daniel's fourth beast, the different phases it would go through, we come to Revelation chapter 17, and he tells us about this resurrection. It says there in verse 3, he carried me away in spirit to the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast full of names of blasphemy. And this beast has, again, 7 heads and 10 horns, identifying it with Daniel's beast with the 10 horns, the 7 heads with the Christian Roman and the pagan Roman Empire. And the woman is arrayed in purple and scarlet color and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. And, of course, we identify her with the Vatican and the religious power that rules it. So this would be a resurrection that would take place, as is indicated in verse 8. The beast which you're looking at, he says, it was, so it existed at one point in time, and then it was not, it disappeared, and it now is going to ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth are going to wonder, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold this beast which was and is not, and yet now is. So it's something that's existed in the past, it's gone away, but it's come back. And that's the exciting part to me about this, because it's come back in the life period, really, of the generation of Christadelphians that are alive now. In some of it, certainly I've seen as a young person growing up, things that didn't exist now do, and it's pretty exciting to look at. Well, of course, as we intimated in the last class, World War I was really an attempt to resurrect this beast. It was kind of the first kick at the can. It had collapsed under Napoleon, it had been destroyed, and so the Kaiser comes along with his plan to resurrect this Reich, this empire. And of course, there was 37 million deaths that resulted out of this, and it was a disaster. But then came World War II, and Hitler and his vision of a new Europe, Das Neue Europa. But again, this whole idea collapsed and went up in flames as well. And it was destroyed and wiped out. And after that, Berlin fell, and the Soviets came along, May 1945, and there was an Allied victory. The armies that made up the Allies were victorious. And here you see Montgomery marching along side by side with the Russian general there as they were victorious over Germany. But it wouldn't take long, and the Allies would carve up Europe between them, as often happens when there's conquering powers. And this is Checkpoint Charlie. I've actually been to Checkpoint Charlie. It's now in Dayton, Ohio. So if you ever want to see it, you can go there and have a look at it. And that's pretty cool. And the Berlin Wall, of course, went up, and it divided Europe. And so we had this division that took place in Europe in the 1960s. And it was kind of like, well, what exactly is God doing? Because the picture that we've got in the book of Revelation of this power that's all come together, and here it's all like completely and absolutely pushed apart. And remember the words of Brother Thomas. The finger of God has indicated a course for Britain which cannot be evaded. Well, the same is true for Europe. I mean, he's got a plan for it, and it's going to happen no matter what it seems like today or not, right? So back in the 60s, which is before I was born, it looked like Europe was divided, and that was kind of the way it was. And so, but when we look at the Bible, we say, well, here's the vision that Ezekiel's given of all these nations, the northern host of the king of the north, Rosh, Meshach, Tubal, and all the nations involved with it, and Persia, and then Libya and Ethiopia, but also the king of the south and the nations involved with it. But when the Warsaw Pact came along, it looked very differently. In 1950-something, the Warsaw Pact saw Europe divided, and there was nations on one side, and then to counterbalance this, we had NATO, which kind of had nations on the other side, and we've split Europe kind of down the middle, right through what would have been the Holy Roman Empire, back in 899 or 799. So Charlemagne's empire is divided in two. This isn't exactly the playbook that the Scripture gives us. But that's just the now. And there were brethren alive who said, well, you know what? It doesn't really matter. It's going to change. And some people thought they were crazy, but this is one of them. This is Brother Graham Pierce, who you probably know, Brother Don Pierce, who writes the Milestones. This is his dad. And this is a booklet he wrote, Russia, the Vatican, the Invasion of Israel. And he says, we could reasonably then expect a general larger scale reorientation of strategic positions. Britain and the U.S. reestablishing themselves in the Near East. This would bring into being two great power blocks, the king of the north, the king of the south. This would include cooperation with Israel and possibly an occupation of Egypt again, possibly, at this time too. Relations between Israel and the Arabs have to be changing, or may be changing. Now, this is written in 1970, the height of the Cold War. Now, growing up, as I did in northern British Columbia, we lived in a city called Prince George, right? Prince George was part of the DEW line, right? The Distant Early Warning System. And we had a big Air Force base there called Boldy Hughes Air Force Base, and it was a radar base that was to track the Russians coming over with their planes to nuclearly annihilate North America. And that's the city we lived in. Make you feel really good. And there was all sirens all through the city that would, it was still sitting there, that would go off, and they would test them every now and again. And that was Prince George. That's northern British Columbia, 500 miles north of Vancouver, looking out for the Russians coming. And I can remember as a young man, we had friends who had these really cool bunkers in their houses. We have tree forts. They had nuclear bunkers, and they were built under the ground, and they had all these stores of food, and we're going to survive the nuclear winter. And I thought, well, this is Prince George. You got to survive winter anyway. It's freezing cold, 67 Celsius below. But nonetheless, this is the way it was, right? This is what we grew up with. And I can remember films that came out, and it was there's one called The Day After, and at school everybody was talking about how terrifying this was. And then there was this other one, something about the Soviets invading, and they all parachuted down. Red Dawn, I think it was called, and there was all this sort of pop culture built around the fear of the Russian invasion that was going on. And that was the 1980s. And Brother Graham said, but that's all got to change. But it sure as heck looked pretty solid when I was a teenager, this is the way it was. And we did the whole, get under your desk and, if there's a nuclear war, put a bag over your head or some crazy thing, I remember thinking, what is that going to do? But I guess that's just for the people picking up the pieces afterwards, maybe. It's not so ugly. But it's just that's the world that as young people we grew up in. It was a fear factor that was going on big time. And then I came, and I was always interested in history, right? So I'm digging into all this stuff and looking at it. And so I took history in grade 12. So my grade 12 history exam comes along. And the week before, my history teacher says to me, okay, kids, when you write your history exam, you got to forget everything that's happened this past year. Because, we're dealing with history. We've just literally rewritten world history because that was the year that the Berlin Wall came crashing down, right? This was the end of the Soviet Union. All of those things that we were all grown up with and terrified about, and it was all over. November 1989. So the events leading up to this were basically saying that this whole Soviet Union thing is all going to collapse. So we were told as we're writing exams, just forget what's going on right now because it's not really the way it is anymore. This is history, write it according to what happened last year. But then in 1991, we had the Gulf War, phenomenal preaching opportunity for us in Prince George. We had, I think, in 10 years previous, maybe 3 people had come to a public lecture and I happened to be the doorkeeper for this event. And Prince George is a small meeting, so you could just react. Signs of the times, boom, we're going to do a lecture on this. So we did one on the Gulf War and whatever else, and we put it in the newspaper, and I was really excited. So I'm, doorkeeper. I'm there 6:30. It doesn't start till 7:30. Gives me an hour. I can get stuff sorted, make sure the room's clean. We rented a room at the college. And I get there, and there's 20 people outside the door. I'm like, oh my goodness, they've double booked the room. I'm thinking what is going on? So I'm like, what are you people here for? And they're like, oh, we're here for the lecture. We want to make sure we get a seat. I'm thinking, nobody's come in a decade. Then I'm thinking oh my goodness, I put the ad in the paper. I put the wrong time on there. I said, well, what time did the ad say? And they're like, 7:30. I'm like, oh, okay. So I got the room opened, and they went in, and people just kept on coming. In Prince George at the time, by the way, we had 24 members. There was 117 visitors. We had to go out through the college using a credit card, break into other rooms, and steal chairs and put them all down the side so that we could pack everybody into this room to have this lecture. And we didn't have a clue what to do with all these people. We were not prepared. Our follow-up was a disaster because it was just we just weren't expecting such a response from this. But brothers and sisters, sometimes these things happen. And we've got to sound the alarm and blow the trumpet. But this is one of the first major things that had happened, the first major war, really, that involved, Canada, United States, and whatever, since the Vietnam War. It was sort of this was one of the first major incidents. And so it was that what we saw was a reorientation. The Warsaw Pact countries just collapsed, 89 to 90. That whole thing just basically ended. And so then it was okay, well, what's going to happen? And they started, I remember them, they were bringing Canadian planes home. We had some back then. They were bringing their planes home to Canada. And, and there was what are we going to do with all our armies? Well, Saddam Hussein came along, and he solved that problem by invading Kuwait, right? So he comes along, he invades Kuwait. And so the planes, instead of taking off and going to Canada, were shipped down to Saudi Arabia. And the whole NATO thing just seemed to sort of fall apart, its purpose and its need, and they were moved into the South. So we had this kind of King of the South buildup going on in the South. And, of course, what we know is that what has to come about at the time of the end is this reorientation, as Brother Graham talked about. There had to be this change that was taking place. So we talked about the American Canadian powers and sort of where they were, and that is another piece, is that now they're moved into the Middle East. So, the Lions of Tarshish and merchants, and so they all of a sudden have a focus down in the Middle East. But there's this other side of it where Europe has to become this great empire. And we know that because the Bible tells us. And so this is the European Union, as is described in Revelation 17:12. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, which receive no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Now notice, they don't have crowns anymore, right? They did, but they don't now, because they're no longer going to be sovereign states in that way. They're going to cede their power and their strength to this great beast that's going to be resurrected. And they're going to have one mind, right? So they're going to be unified in their thinking. They're going to give their power and strength to the beast. That's what the Bible has to say. So the word power, the Strong's is 1411. It means the power of influence, belonging to wealth, arising from numbers, resting upon armies, forces, or hosts. So it's both monetary and military power. And the word strength is the idea of the power of choice of liberty, of rule of government, of power of judicial decisions, the authority to manage domestic affairs by yourself. That's the change that has to take place. Now, what's amazing is that following World War II, the nations in Europe decided, okay, this is really not working out. We got to come at this a different way. Because if we look back at our history, it was the French, fighting the rest of Europe in the French Revolution, Napoleon. And that really didn't go so well. And so then the Germans took over and decided they'd try and thrash the French in the First World War and the rest of Europe, and that didn't go so well. And then the Germans tried again during the Second World War, and that didn't go so well either. So we need to come up with another idea. So in 1957, they signed this treaty in Europe, which was a coal and steel pact. So it's like you can't build armies without steel, and you can't run them without coal. I mean, this is going back to, you needed this to run all your equipment, whatever. So they signed this agreement. They figure if we can control the materials to build an army, we can control armies from happening and all these problems happening in Europe. And so what this writer has to say, Willem Buter, he says, as a blend of national and supranational, the EU resembles the Holy Roman Empire, which united Central Europe from the 10th century under Luther, technically until 1806, which is when Napoleon came along and his last name, right, is blown apart, right? That's what he did, Napoleon, he blew it all apart, right, or blown apart, it's close enough. So the idea is, the beast that thou sawest, well, it was, and then it wasn't, but it's back. And this guy's telling you, what you're looking at in Europe today is that beast resurrected. But better than him, we've got actually the president of the European Union, and this is what he has to say.
Sometimes I like to compare the European Union as a creation to the organization of empires. The empires. And because we have the dimension of empires. But there is a great difference. The empires were usually made through force, with a center that was imposing a diktat, a will on the others. And now we have what some authors call the first non-imperial empire. We have, by dimension, 27 countries that freely decided to work together, to pool their sovereignties, if you want to use that concept of sovereignty, and work together to add value. I believe it's a great construction, and we should be proud of it. At least we in the Commission are proud of our union.
So there is the President of the European Union. This is going back to 2007. And what he's telling us is that what you have in the European Union is a construction of an empire. Except it's a different empire. Because instead of what happened in 1789 and Napoleon following that, and World War I and World War II, where you had somebody trying to impose a dictation over others, you have all these countries who freely agreed to give up their sovereignty and pull it into what is today an empire. That is exactly the way it's described in Revelation chapter 17. They have no kingdom as yet. They've tried it under Napoleon. They tried it under Kaiser Wilhelm. They tried it under Adolf Hitler, but they couldn't pull it together. So what they've done is they now have decided. They have one mind, one way of thinking, which is coming out of the frog spirit thinking, which we're not going to get into, but they give their power and strength to the beast. And for us over here, it's a little difficult to understand the European Union because it's the most bizarre thing that's ever existed in the construction of government. I'm going to play you a little clip just to kind of give you an idea of what it is, because for us in a democratic society, it doesn't make any sense.
The European Union, which imposes laws on 28 countries, is made up of 7 main institutions, which include the European Council, the Council of the European Union, the Court of Justice of the European Union, the European Commission, and the European Parliament.
One side knows. If one side is a priesthood and knows how it all works, and the rest of us, ordinary citizens, don't know how it works, a massive transfer of power takes place.
It was devised to make sure that the great mass of the people could not control government ever again.
In the EU, there's a thing called a parliament, but it's not a parliament as we know it. In the EU, the parliament isn't in charge.
This is the only parliament the world's ever invented where you cannot initiate legislation, propose legislation, or even the repeal of legislation. All of that comes from the unelected European Commission.
So you can't propose a law and try and get it passed?
No, absolutely not. Parliamentary democracy, once every 5 years, you can throw everything out of the window and start again. With this, once something is European law, there is nothing through a democratic process the voter can do to change it.
The people whom we elect to go to Brussels have almost no power at all. They do what they're told.
Got even less power than the House of Lords, for goodness sake.
Our votes for these people are pointless. They are fundamentally pointless.
The European Parliament's an irrelevance. The European Union bureaucratic structures, who are appointed, not elected, have all the real power.
The real power in the EU, including the power to legislate, resides not with the Parliament, but with EU officials. They debate their laws in secret. We are not allowed to hear or read their deliberations. We are now subjects of a vastly complex state machine.
Now, try to get that passed in America. You know, like, you just think about it. It is the most nonsensical form of government that's really ever existed. But that's the European Union. And it's interesting. This is Elmar Brok. He's the German EU parliamentary member. And this is what he has to say. And chairman, by the way, of the European Parliament Committee on Foreign Affairs, right? So he's in charge of foreign relations for the EU. He says, on our own, none of us are big enough. Only by being together economically and militarily can we challenge and overtake America. I mean, that's their goal, to challenge and overtake America. But notice the two ways he says, militarily and economically, which, if you go back to Revelation 17, is the meaning behind the words power and strength. So those two things come together, and this is what exists today in the world that we're living in. And if we don't get the complexity, brothers and sisters and young people, of you know, all of the politics in Revelation 17, the angels are very gracious with us, because they just kind of, like, you know, point it out to us, because they say, okay, here's a woman riding a beast. And of course, it's Europa. Greek mythology, she was seduced. She was actually the daughter of the Phoenician king, and she's seduced by Zeus, and she's taken off, and that's the picture that they look at of a woman riding the beast. But of course, the book of Revelation, it's a woman riding the beast. And you know, you look at this, Time magazine picked it up in 1991, a woman riding the beast. And as Brother John Ramsden pointed out, you'll notice there's no British flag on the back there, because they're out, right? The New Europe. And they pick up on this. And so Babylon, right? Babylon the Greats in Revelation chapter 17. And so how does the European Union choose to depict itself? Well, this is a poster going back from 1992, and it says, you know, Europe, many tongues, one voice. And they depict themselves by the Tower of Babel. And if that wasn't enough, like just some, you know, off-the-shot kind of, you know, some crazy graphic designer put this together, they go and build this very structure in Strasbourg to basically show that they are the Tower of Babel undoing. I mean, this is like in the face of Almighty God. God divided nations by language, and they've turned around and said, ha, we're going to undo all that in this European Union. And then they struck a coin in 2002. The euro came into being, and there it is. And brothers and sisters, especially young people, in 1989, you know, we were privileged to be doing a class with my Uncle Paul back in Prince George, and we were doing Revelation, and we were looking at Daniel, and we were looking at, you know, Revelation 17 and this European Union all coming together. And we were like, man, this is incredible, because they're actually going to pull their sovereignty, because they're going to have this euro, and it's going to come together, and it's all going to be one currency. And they're going to tie themselves together. One of the coins ends up being a woman riding the beast. I mean, this is the Greek version. You know what I mean? Like, it's just amazing. And yet it happened, and we got to go to Brussels, and I was there with Brother John Ramsden and another brother, Peter Moore. And as we're standing outside of Brussels, this is Strasbourg, but in the Brussels one, there's like a big statue of a woman riding the beast. And you're just like, I learned about this as a young person, that one day this would happen. I went to Europe, and I'm standing there, and here it is. So we go into the Council of Europe chamber, and there is Brother Peter, and Brother Peter looks up and he says, you know, he says, I just had a really eerie thought. He says, we are standing in the Parliament building where the horns are going to get together, and they're going to take the vote to make war with the Lamb. Now, that didn't exist when I was 14, 15 years old, but it's there today, and that is the structure that's there. This is how fast things have happened. So they're going to give their power and their strength to the beast. Now, the other word there is, of course, this word power, which is the idea of that arising from numbers or resting upon armies, forces, and hosts. And so that's in keeping, not just with Revelation, but back in Ezekiel chapter 38 that we had read. When they come forth, there's going to be this great army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor. They've got great company with bucklers and shields, and they're all handling swords. So it's a military power, both in Russia and in Europe, that is going to be combined to come in the latter day against the nation of Israel. Well, this last few weeks, amazingly enough, what has been going on, actually since last year, December 2017, is something called the Permanent Structure of Cooperation, or PESCO, which is basically, because Britain left the European Union, a 70-year-old ambition on Thursday has been realized to integrate the defense forces. And I just want you to listen to this little clip, because this isn't, us, Bible prophecy nuts. This is what's going on in the world.
You know that the main outcome and news of today is this. The letter that 23 member states addressed and signed to me today, after 1 year and a couple of months of hard common work, to notify their common intention to start a permanent structured cooperation. This is the first time that that provision of the Lisbon Treaty, that the Treaty of the European Union, is used. So it's quite an historic day.
More than half a century ago, an ambitious vision of the European defense community was created, but what was missing was the unity and courage to put it into practice. Since then, this idea was revisited many times, but to no effect. The dream was at odds with reality. Today, this dream becomes reality. We are launching permanent structured cooperation, so-called PESCO, which is a practical expression of our will to build European defense. For many years, the strongest argument against PESCO had been the fear that it would lead to the weakening of NATO.
The launch of permanent structured cooperation has been a united effort. From the military point of view, an ambitious and inclusive cooperation platform demonstrates the willingness of 25 member nations to make a European Union militarily stronger.
So if you picked up the little headline there, together we are stronger to face global threats. So this has all taken place in the last 6 months, right? So here is Federica, the vice president, or the high representative of the European. So she's like your State Department head at this point in time. And we've achieved a permanent structure cooperation on defense, and we're going to join forces, do things together, spend together, invest together, buy together, act together. I mean, this is Revelation chapter 17. They're going to do all of this together. They have given their power militarily and their strength to the beast. And remember, for the longest time, right, as he said, that the fear was that this would compete with NATO. But of course, Trump has just kind of turned around and said, folks, like, you don't spend any money on NATO, and we're not holding the bag anymore. You're going to have to cough up. And the European nations said, okay, yeah, but if we're going to cough up, why don't we just go it alone? And that's more or less what they've sort of decided that they're going to do. We want Europe to have strategic and defense autonomy, says Macron, the leader of France. And he says, look, this is what basically is going to be. He says, we need to reconsider our relations with Russia. We need to work out a better deal with Russia and stop being, against her, but come up with some kind of cooperation. This wider Europe should build its security architecture with the powers which are on its borders and the great nations which share history with us. So that's the idea. Let's get Russia involved. And he also stressed the need to engage with Russia and Turkey on multiple issues, saying the history of these people is made with Europe. We must accept that there will be a large Europe, larger even than the European Union, and Russia is going to be involved in this. Well, that's Ezekiel chapter 38. And brothers and sisters, young people, this has all gone down. That's August the 27th of last month. We're talking within the last 30 days. These are the statements that are coming out of the European Union. Here's Merkel of Germany. This is May. She says, look, it used to be, this is what we need for our survival because the nature of conflicts has changed completely since the end of the Cold War. A great many global conflicts are taking place on Europe's doorstep, and it is not the case that the United States of America will simply protect us. Instead, Europe must take its destiny into its own hands. That is our job for the future. And so when you look at Trump, who's come along and he's said a lot of stuff, and he's rattled a lot of nations. This is some of the outcome. This is the fallout, which is basically the words of Ezekiel 38 and Revelation coming together. So, the big argument is, well, NATO can still exist. It's still possible. But as we're going to hear, that's not really the case.
Mr. Trump will be at that NATO summit next week. You appear to be hell-bent on pushing for your European army, hell-bent for a foreign policy without veto, and hell-bent to be on a direct collision course with President Trump and with NATO. You can't have a European army and NATO existing side by side.
A whole range of issues were discussed during the two-day meeting of NATO defence ministers here in Brussels. The alliance is concerned that its role will be undermined if the new EU army, currently being established, duplicates NATO's functions. 22 of the 29 countries in NATO are also members of the European Union.
They will really be the losers if they end up with two competing structures with two competing capability targets.
Common defence is a unitary military for the European Union under a single line of command. And Mr. Juncker said in September last year that will be formed by the end of 2024.
Are the EU trying to undermine NATO?
They've actively done so quite regularly. If you look at the words of Mr. Juncker again, and to try to create a duplicating structure would appear to threaten NATO. They've created 20 separate structures which directly duplicate or have the potential to duplicate what NATO already does. And that's quite unhealthy, those of us who believe in NATO. They've done several other things that detract from NATO, not just the structural duplication that I mentioned before, but a kind of a concealment of their activity, which, when you look at what they're doing, what is under that concealment, it's an effort to push forward on their own strategic autonomy, they call it. Autonomy from NATO, that's the specific wording that's found in the EU agreements for 2017. And to do that in such an underhanded way, and such careful lexicon which can throw people off the scent, they're clearly detracting and undermining NATO. Putin would want the EU to continue on the ridiculous path it's going down now because it assists Putin. Juncker's military developments, all of the agreements and structures that they've created simply play into the hands of Putin. If people in politics and in Parliament knew more about the vast structures and agreements that have been created in the last year and a half, then they would know how much it detracts from NATO, how much it undermines the integrity of the Western alliance, and how much it actually does Putin favors.
So you get the idea. And again, we can comment on this, but I find sometimes it's a little bit more powerful just to have politicians out in the world tell you this is where it's at. With the European Union constructing this own army, NATO, basically, as it existed, is going to be a thing of the past. I mean, we saw the Warsaw Pact disappear. NATO has remained. It's expanded and so on. But now with Trump coming along and saying what he's had to say, and the European Union then deciding, well, since Britain's gotten out of the European Union, they were the one that was stopping the Europeans from actually developing an army. We're going to go ahead and we are going to do that ourselves, which is exactly what we expect from Daniel, what we expect from Ezekiel, and what we expect from Revelation. So the European Union comes into play, and of course, NATO becomes a thing of the past, and Britain as well has to get out of that whole scenario, as we've talked about in the past. And so, interestingly, this is a map from the European Union. These are the areas so far of European military engagement, and it's in the areas of Libya, Ethiopia and Sudan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Georgia, all of which are involved in the Ezekiel 38 contest that we've been talking about. And so those are the nations, basically, that it has been involving itself with, and we're going to see that grow even more. And of course, we know eventually who they're going to involve themselves with, and that is going to be the nation of Israel. So what's interesting to see is, of course, that Britain had to be extracted from this. And this is kind of yesterday's news, but I just want to kind of focus on this for a moment because it's got some great implications for what's taking place in the world. When we went to Britain a few years ago, these were some of the signs that we saw: vote leave all over the place. This was just before the referendum would take place. And there was this great decision that had to be made. But again, I'd like you to listen to how they understand it over there. For us, it seems almost crazy, this whole NATO, or not NATO, this European Union thing. But this is what Britain understood by it.
We're being asked to give up the right to govern ourselves. What are we being offered in return that could possibly be worth it?
What really matters is that you should have the power to remove the people who govern you.
We're about to choose how we want to live our lives.
This is the single most important political decision any of us will make in our lifetimes.
It's been more than 40 years since we were last asked. It could be a half-century before we're asked again, if we're asked at all.
I think this is the last chance that we'll be able to vote on EU membership when we still have a recognisable identity as Britons. And what makes it scary is that if we go the wrong way, we're in it for certainly my lifetime, and probably my kids' lifetime.
This is about our ability to say to ourselves that we are a genuinely democratic and free people. That's how important this is.
This is the most important voting decision that any of us is going to make in our lifetime. With general elections, it doesn't really matter who you vote for, Conservative or Labour, because you know that in 4 years' time, you can change your mind. This time you can't change your mind. This time is for keeps.
So that kind of gives us a little bit of an idea of how Britain had to face this. And we gave a few pieces of this before the vote in Britain, and fairly confidently could say to the audience we were giving to it then, I mean, it's a foregone conclusion, this Brexit thing. I mean, it was like Trump coming into power, right? Every so never happened, not a chance. Well, Brexit was the same deal. Like, I mean, it's just, this is what God has been telling us about in the prophets. This is going to take place, and it did. And so we have those identity of the nations, basically, that would be there in Ezekiel chapter 38, and this is the picture that's given to us of a king of the north and of a king of the south, and Tarshish being removed from that. So Bible prophecy is very clear, and that is basically that Britain had to get out of the EU, and that is exactly what it has done. It has voted to leave, and it really was against all odds. In fact, you know, brought to mind again is the words of Brother Thomas: the finger of God has indicated a course to be pursued by Britain which cannot be evaded. And so it was that, you know, the newspaper articles were out, was the headline of the Daily Mail, and then there was another one in the Sun, which was see EU later, or see you later. And Independence Day was touted all over the place, of this is kind of like Britain receiving its independence. And it's ironic because, you know, they're stuck in this empire. What's their issue? taxation without representation. They don't have any right to make their own decisions, and they basically find themselves where America did when it left the British Empire all those years ago. Britain was in exactly the same place and had to do the same thing and had to rebel and had to pull out of this alliance so that it could hook itself up again with Sheba and Dedan and with the merchants of Tarshish and all the young lions thereof. I have one last little clip I want to play because it's not just the fact they got out, but it's what does that mean now? And Nigel Farage is just going to tell us what that has created.
And in terms of developing our international trade relationships, which we've been banned from doing for the last 40 years, I think the message politically to America is that your oldest and best ally is now free to be that once again. We will be outside a European foreign policy, able to make our own decisions, outside the military structures, which I think threatened on an ongoing basis our cooperation through NATO and elsewhere. And in terms of trade, but the United Kingdom and America could conclude a free trade deal, and we could do it in a matter of months. How does it all look going up? What's going to happen? Well, you know, what's going to happen is you guys are going to see a lot of Liam Fox, right, who I've explained already through the Atlantic Council and everything else, is a genuinely pro-American British politician, and he is going to be reaching out here in America, and I hope that gets reciprocated. There are countries all over the world, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, hints from India, countries all over the world wanting to be at the front of the queue. Yeah, you listening, Obama? Who want to do trade deals with us. Provided the British government is resolute, we can sort out the European question, we can re-engage with you, our friends in the Commonwealth, and actually we'll look back on this in years to come and we'll say all we did was to end an abusive relationship, to opt for freedom, and to opt for Britain being a full global trading nation.
So that's the outcome of what has happened in Britain. And it's interesting, the news this morning, Prime Minister May, her checkers plan, which was to sort of like, she was opposed to Brexit. She wanted to stay with the European Union, as was David Cameron. And, she wrote this plan up that was going to have them sort of somewhat quasi-tied to the European Union for trading. And the European Union this morning said, stick it in your ear, we're not interested, and basically blew the whole thing to smithereens. So it looks like for Britain, they're going to end up with no deal with Europe, which is going to force them, and I don't know if you picked up who he said there, we've got to go back to America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and India. Well, where have we heard all those nations before? That's the merchants of Tarshish and all the young lions are. I mean, brothers and sisters, this is the Bible coming to life right in front of us. The very words written by the prophets thousands of years ago are happening. And just take a look at some of these milestones as you just kind of reflect on this class that we've looked at. The French Revolution, 1789, put an end to the Holy Roman Empire, which finally ended in 1806. In 1914 to 1917, we had World War I, where Germany and Turkey were defeated. Turkey joined Germany and so opened the ability for the British to go into Palestine, which they did, and push them right out of that area so that Israel could be established. 39 to 45, World War II, they tried again to resurrect the empire. Germany and Italy were also defeated. 1958, the European Union comes along, starting out as a coal and steel agreement, the EEC. It's formed to stop this from ever happening again. 1961, the Berlin Wall goes up. Seems that we've got a problem going on. Europe is divided. 1974, Britain joined the EU. And then 1986, the Single European Act is formed, and Britain was pulled in even further. They put their money in with them at first, lost £1 billion or whatever, and then pulled out, so they separated from it. 1989, the Berlin Wall falls down. Germany is reunited. These nations now on the eastern side, the communist side, are free to join the EU. 1993, the EU becomes, the Maastricht Treaty is signed. And 2002, monetary union takes place. They give their monetary power to the beast. And when you look at that, 2007, the political treaty, the Lisbon Treaty is signed. And then Britain, 10 years later, has to get out. They vote to leave, and they create a European army. And with that European army that they've created this year, we know what the Bible says. With that army, these will have one mind, will give their power and their strength, their military and monetary and political power to the beast. And with that army that they've created, they're going to make war with the Lamb. The Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords, King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And brothers and sisters, we've all been called. I mean, the word is kaleo in the Greek. It means to invite. It's not some fairy dust that comes down on you. It's literally the invitation of the gospel. Paul says, we've called you with our gospel. The question is, will we be chosen? And this is the unlock to that riddle. If we're faithful to the call, then we will be chosen. And so, brothers and sisters, what we've got to do is examine our lives, and we see these things going on all around us. As I said, when I was a young man, there was no European Union, there was no parliament, there was no monetary union. All that's happened. And now they have an army to speak to the words of Revelation 17:13 and also of Ezekiel chapter 38, so that the pieces are in place that they can enact what God has called them to do and be brought into the Middle East and to be humbled there and eventually to be annihilated as the kingdom of God is set up and the nations of this world become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever.